We're used to historical mysteries having maybe, a ruined chapel, a disputed bone, a location that's contested, but at least exists as a debate. With Wolsey, there isn't even that. There's a total, unnerving vacuum where a monument should be. And the longer you stare at it, the stranger it gets. No confirmed grave, not damaged, not disputed, just gone. And I want you to hold that word, unknown, because in the context of who this man was, that word is almost absurd. Thomas Wolsey did not live quietly. He didn't slip through Tudor England unnoticed, leaving a faint trace in the margins of someone else's history. He was the center of the thing. He was Lord Chancellor, Cardinal, Archbishop of York. He was the man who directed foreign policy, managed the courts, controlled the treasury, and ran the day-to-day government of an entire kingdom. While Henry VIII, young, restless, more interested in hunting and war than administration, left the actual governing to him, Wolsey was England's government in any practical sense. Henry wore the crown, Wolsey held the pen. And the gap between those two things, in terms of actual power over actual events, was considerable. Men like that leave graves, not just graves, monuments, tombs with effigies, chapels commissioned in advance, names carved into stone in letters deep enough to survive centuries. That was how the Tudor world worked. Power was performed visibly in life and preserved visibly in death. The physical record of a man's importance was part of the point. Wolsey has none of it. And what followed his death, the silence, the absence, the impossibility of locating him, did not happen by accident. I don't believe that. And by the end of this, I don't think you will either. Here is the official account. It moves fast, so pay attention. Wolsey died in November 1530. He died at Leicester Abbey, sick and under arrest, being transported to London to face charges of treason. He never made it to trial. He collapsed on the road, was carried into the abbey, and died within days. Now, the official account tells us he just collapsed at Leicester. And I'll be honest, I don't buy that it was that simple. In the Tudor world, collapsing under arrest was often the body's response to a psychological death sentence that had already been passed by the king. Wolsey knew he wasn't going to London for a fair hearing. He knew what the charges meant. He knew what happened to men who went to trial in Henry's court with the king already decided against them. He was 60 years old. He had been stripped of everything. And he was being taken, in winter, to a city that had already condemned him in all but name. His body gave out, but the process that killed him started long before Leicester. He was buried there. No monument survives. No stone bearing his name has been confirmed. A coffin, placed in the ground on borrowed ground, by men who understood, who had to understand, that they were burying the man who had once been the most powerful figure in England outside the monarchy itself. And then, 8 years later, the abbey was dissolved. Henry's campaign against the monasteries swept through England between 1536 and 1541. Leicester Abbey was stripped, abandoned, reduced to rubble. Its stones were taken for other buildings, its records scattered, its graves left to whatever the destruction brought. That, says the standard account, is why there's no grave. Chaos, destruction, an unfortunate casualty of history's machinery. I understand why that explanation exists. It's clean. It requires no one to have made a deliberate choice. It asks only that we accept the obvious. The dissolution was enormous and destructive. Records were lost everywhere, and Wolsey was one casualty among thousands. But here's where it falls apart. It treats Wolsey as though he were ordinary, and his removal from power was anything but ordinary. When Henry turned on Wolsey in 1529, he didn't dismiss him. He didn't pension him off to a comfortable retirement in the country. He dismantled him. Hampton Court was taken. York Place was taken. His wealth was seized. His titles were stripped. His reputation was publicly destroyed through a legal process designed not just to remove him, but to ensure no path back, no rehabilitation, no return. This wasn't a fall from favor. It was a methodical, piece-by-piece destruction of every instrument of power Wolsey had accumulated over 15 years. So here's the question that the standard account never quite answers. If Henry went to that level of precision, removing Wolsey's power in life, why would everything about his death be left to chance? There's no document ordering Wolsey's grave hidden, no royal instruction, no letter. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And when you look at the circumstances of the burial and what followed, a pattern emerges that is uncomfortable to look at directly. Wolsey was buried in a hurry. No ceremony, no marker. He was buried at an institution that had every political reason to bury him quietly, and no political protection for doing anything else. His household, the network of loyal servants who would have pushed for a proper burial, was gone. They would have pressured the abbey to maintain a record and kept his memory alive after his death. They were dispersed in the months before his arrest by a crown that had systematically removed every person who might advocate for him. Then 8 years pass. Then the abbey is dissolved. Not by accident, not by fire or flood, by royal decree. Henry chose the timing. Henry managed the process. Henry decided, institution by institution, what would be preserved and what would not. Wolsey's grave sat inside a system shaped by Henry's decisions, and it did not survive. 2 readings are possible. I'll give them both fairly. Because this is the kind of case where intellectual honesty matters more than a satisfying conclusion. The first, this was chaos, not conspiracy, and the dissolution was vast and imprecise. Thousands of graves across England were disrupted, and Wolsey was one casualty among many. Nothing here required intent, only indifference, and the brutal arithmetic of a process that didn't stop to check what it was destroying. The second, Henry may have created the conditions under which Wolsey's grave would not survive, not through a single order. It was through the accumulated logic of a court where people understood, without being told, what was expected of them. Those 2 readings produce identical outcomes, and that, right there, is the problem this case has never resolved. Before you settle into either interpretation, you need to understand something about the records you're relying on. They were produced inside the system you're trying to analyze, and Tudor documentation was not objective. It was created by people with interests, preserved by institutions whose survival often depended on supporting the correct version of events. When you look at what happened to Wolsey in 1529 and 1530, you're not reading a neutral archive. You're reading a record that was filtered from the very beginning by a court that had every reason to manage the story carefully. That matters here, more than in almost any other case. The only man who saw what happened at Leicester doesn't fully explain it. George Cavendish was Wolsey's gentleman usher, and he was there. He witnessed the final days, the illness, the conversations Wolsey had in the hours before he died, the burial itself. His biography of Wolsey is the closest thing we have to a first-hand account of what happened. Cavendish was loyal, wrote his account partly as an act of vindication, and wanted the record corrected. His master remembered, fairly, and he had every reason to state, clearly and bitterly, if the burial had been deliberately shameful. He was not a man who would hold back, and yet, what he describes is something more ambiguous than outright shame. It was a burial that was hasty, undistinguished, as though everyone present understood, without needing to be told, that this was not a moment for ceremony. Cavendish records it with a kind of resigned sadness, not fury, not accusation, but it is the quiet grief of a man who had expected better, and found he couldn't even make the case for it. He doesn't say they were ordered to bury Wolsey without honor. He doesn't say they chose to. And he leaves it in the space between those 2 things. Whether that was assumed, or understood, or quietly communicated through channels Cavendish couldn't name, he doesn't tell us. And that ambiguity, in the account of the only witness, is the first place the evidence starts to fracture. Now look at the abbey itself, and here's something that tends to get overlooked. Monks were not shy about recording significant burials, and a cardinal buried within your walls was a distinction. It was good for the institution's reputation, and it attracted pilgrims, patronage, donations. Abbeys actively wanted to be known as the resting place of important figures, and it was, in the most literal sense, good for business. So why the sudden amnesia at Leicester? There's no surviving record from within the abbey clearly identifying where Wolsey was placed. No institutional note, no entry saying, "The cardinal was buried here, in this location, in November of 1530. The kind of record that a functioning religious house would routinely produce and routinely keep appears to be absent. The most obvious explanation is that they were more afraid of Henry than they were motivated by institutional pride. That marking Wolsey's grave, even in their own internal records, carried a risk they weren't willing to take. A man dying under arrest, charged with treason, in transit to trial for betraying the crown to a foreign power. Advertising your connection to him was not a strategic move. That's the charitable reading. Institutional self-preservation. But the absence of a surviving marker isn't fully explained by political caution alone. Because disgraced men in worse circumstances than Wolsey, still received identifiable burials. Their families intervened, their remaining allies pushed. Someone always ensured a record existed somewhere, even if it was private, even if it wasn't displayed. Wolsey had no one to do that, and that absence of advocates was not accidental. In the months before his arrest, the crown had been quietly removing the people around him. Not dramatically, carefully. Servants questioned, loyalists reassigned. The entire network of people who had operated around Wolsey for 15 years either removed or sufficiently warned that they understood the message. By the time he died, there was no one left who was both willing and able to insist on how he was buried. That dispersal is documented. What isn't documented, what cannot be proven, is whether it was calculated to extend beyond his living career. But look at the outcome. The man with no allies received no advocacy. The institution with no protection gave no special treatment. The grave with no marker left no record, and the abbey that held all of it was dissolved 8 years later. Each step follows logically from the one before. Each step served the same outcome. Now, the dissolution itself, because this is where the conflicting evidence becomes genuinely hard to navigate. Leicester Abbey was dissolved in 1538, 8 years after Wolsey's burial. During those 8 years, the abbey functioned. Monks continued their routines. Records were maintained. Life went on in the way it did in religious institutions across England before the storm arrived. Here is the question those 8 years raise. If the grave had been marked in any way, even modestly, it would have been there for 8 years. 8 years during which travelers passed through Leicester. 8 years during which chroniclers moved around England noting significant burial sites. 8 years during which the abbey itself was producing institutional records. And yet, there is no surviving record from those 8 years, clearly identifying the location of Wolsey's grave. One response to that is simple. The grave was never marked, so there was nothing to record, and the silence confirms the original absence because you cannot document what isn't there. That's reasonable, but there's another response that's equally reasonable and considerably more unsettling. That the silence of those 8 years reflects not the absence of a grave, but the absence of anyone willing to acknowledge it. That monks who knew perfectly well where the cardinal was buried chose, or were helped to choose, not to record the fact. This was because recording it served no one's interest, and it might attract exactly the kind of attention no one in Leicester wanted. Both are consistent with what we have, which is why this case has never closed, And then there is the detail that breaks both the simple narratives. Wolsey's name survived, and his story circulated. His career was documented, and multiple accounts of his rise and fall were written and read during Henry's own lifetime, and Henry allowed it. That is not the behavior of a king attempting total erasure. So what was it? The version of Wolsey that survived was a specific one. That story was useful. The story of a man who reached too high, placed the wrong loyalties in the wrong place, failed the king at the worst possible moment, and was destroyed for it. It was a standing demonstration of what happened to men who confused their own power with the king's. Henry didn't need Wolsey forgotten. He needed Wolsey remembered in that specific way, in those specific terms, and no other. The story served the lesson. The grave would have complicated it. Here is where I have to be honest with you about the limits of what we can know. Every explanation in this case explains part of the picture, but none of them explains all of it. And that's not a failure of research. It's a structural feature of this particular problem. The dissolution explains the missing grave, but not the 8 years before the dissolution when no record of the location appears to have been kept. The disgrace explains the lack of ceremony, but disgraced men attainted and executed, men in far worse standing than Wolsey at the moment of his death, still received identifiable burials. The dispersal of his household explains why no one advocated for him. But that dispersal happened inside a process controlled by the crown, which had every reason to ensure no advocate remained. Each explanation is logical, and each one stops just short of accounting for everything. And the cumulative effect of all of them pointing in the same direction toward a single, convenient outcome is not something that honest analysis I can simply wave away. So let me offer the interpretation I find most persuasive. Not as fact, but as the reading that best fits the totality of the evidence. Henry VIII did not erase Wolsey. He edited him. The Wolsey that survived was a curated version, a specific lesson preserved in the form that served the crown. The failure, the overreach, the fall, all of it kept in circulation, kept visible, kept available as a warning. This was a warning to every official who might be tempted to accumulate too much power or serve too many masters. The location, the grave that would have made him present and grievable, and subject to re-evaluation that was allowed to disappear.